Mr. Seignthaler has been with us the better part of yesterday and today, and has been very busy in talking about the events of '62 and the riots that happened here that focused around James Meredith. And so what I'm going to do is introduce both of our speakers today, starting from my left, is Mr. Ken Wooten, who is a former dean of admissions and the registrar at the University of Mississippi. Mr. Wooten was in the Lyceum and spent the better part of the night there during the rioting. And I just wanted to, he heard, the voice of Bobby Kennedy, calling through phone lines at the time, and was sort of in the command central location and heard a lot of the news, in a sense, as it was really breaking. And I wanted just to share a paragraph from an email that he sent earlier this week, where he wrote to us. He was making plans to join us, and he said, "I'm sure Mr. Seigenthaler heard the same exchanges as we did in the Lyceum office. We had the added benefit of observing reactions of those directing the local operation. We saw their faces when Bobby Kennedy issued orders and heard the Bostonian accent when he denied the use of firearms. Mr. Kennedy averted a massacre. Although my little group did little but answer telephones from throughout the world and provide logistical support for the marshals, he was thoughtful enough to issue citations that became a part of the university library collection of artifacts. I suppose, as did those courageous reporters outside, we experienced sordid historical events that changed our society for the better." So we're happy to have Ken with us today. And then let me proceed to introduce Mr. Seigenthaler to my left and to your right. John Seigenthaler is I'm sure known to many of you. Mr. Seigenthaler founded the First Amendment Center in 1991 with the mission of creating a national discussion, dialogue, and debate about First Amendment rights and values. Former president of the American Society of Newspaper Editors, Mr. Seigenthaler served for 43 years as an award-winning journalist for the Tennessean, Nashville's morning newspaper. At his retirement, he was editor, publisher, and CEO. He retains the title Chairman Emeritus. In 1982, Mr. Seigenthaler became the founding editorial director of USA Today and served in that position for a decade, retiring both from the Nashville and national newspapers in 1991. His career then blossoms further. Mr. Seigenthaler left journalism briefly in the early 60s to serve in the U.S. Justice Department as administrative assistant to then Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. His work in the field of civil rights led to his service as chief negotiator with the governor of Alabama during the Freedom Rides. During that crisis, while attempting to aid freedom riders in Montgomery, Alabama, he was attacked by a mob of Klansmen and hospitalized. Seigenthaler hosts a weekly book review program, A Word on Words. He is a senior advisory trustee of the Freedom Forum, and since the death of Arthur Schlesinger, Jr., a historian you all should know, he was chaired the Robert F. Kennedy Book Awards for the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Justice and Human Rights, and he is Chairman Emeritus of the annual Profile and Courage Award Selection Committee of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. We want to welcome both speakers today. The order of the program is each speaker will talk for a time, 10, 15 minutes perhaps at the most. They can dialogue with each other during that time, but after that speaking time, that individual speaking time, they can engage in a conversation, and I encourage you all to take part in that conversation with questions and comments. So with that, we welcome you, and Mr. Wooten, you may go first.
Because I'm older, I assume. I was a new employee of the university. I started to work in '59 as a recruiter and was in the student personnel division. And I'll just sort of tell you a few of the facts because I don't have the resume that John has here, and nor the ability to inspire as he does. So you're really looking forward to him, and I'll get through mine very quickly. But it was a Sunday afternoon, the day much like today, beautiful day. And toward late afternoon, I got a call from our Dean of Students. And the people who were in student affairs then, there were 5 of us. And he said, come on in, this is happening, and what we need to do is to answer the telephones and to give support to the marshals because they were scattered all about the campus and they didn't know the topography. So we would, they would call in and, about a particular building and where they should be and that sort of thing. So we were helping them. But primarily we were answering the telephone because there were people calling from all over the world, news media, and of course parents, and we were trying to assure them that everything was going to be okay. And so the nightfall came and the business of rioting began in earnest. At that particular point, the 5 of us, and we were in what is now, I suppose, Vice Chancellor's offices there in the Lyceum building. It was the south end where then was the registrar's office. And that's where the marshals, when they came in, had set up their headquarters. And they were there, and communication wasn't what it is today in 52 or 62, as you might imagine. And so since there were 4 or 5 of them, John Doerr was there, and McDougal, I believe, and
McShane, certainly.
Well, yeah, but he was directing the marshals.
The marshals, that's right.
Primarily, he was in and out. So they set up an open mic so that they all could hear Mr. Kennedy, who was Attorney General that was on the other end of the line in Washington. And they had the speaker on so that everybody could hear, but that meant that we university officials could also hear. But after darkness came on and it became fairly serious, we decided that we must go out and tell students to go back to their dormitories because, back then, students would listen to a university administrator. I'm not sure that's the case anymore. And we knew just about all the students. We were small enough that we could do that. So we told the marshals we wanted to go out into the grove where the rioting was going on. And the marshal said, well, no, you can't go. They said, well, we feel it's our duty. And Mr. McShane said, well, you can go, but we can't protect you. I said, well, we'll take the chance. And he said, well, now, what's going to happen if they start rushing this building? We're going to shoot in these tear gas canisters, and if one of them hits you, that's pretty bad. They're about so big, and about yay long. But we felt that it was our duty to go and to try to identify students and encourage them to go back to their housing. So we walked across the street in front of the Lyceum. Let me give you, before I tell you that, let me give you the picture. What happened when the marshals came in, they came in these huge army trucks, and they encircled the Lyceum building, bumper to bumper, all the way around. Mr. Meredith was housed up in Baxter Dormitory, and he had only a small contingent of troops that were protecting him. All the action was in front of the Lyceum in this circle and the grove. When I came on campus, it was just like a football game, and that people were, and they incidentally were people from all over. What had been happening in the course of about a month, practically every other day, marshals would bring Mr. Meredith into the campus. Ross Barnett, the governor of the state, would fly up in his plane from Jackson and would turn him away. And it became sort of a joke. Most of us on campus, didn't realize that all of this was going to transpire. So we would take our brown bags out into the grove and watch as the marshals would come up and bring Mr. Meredith, and the governor or the lieutenant governor would turn him away. And so we thought that Mr. Barnett, in the final analysis, would stand in the schoolhouse door, but would say, I have to obey the law, so I'll step back in protest and let Mr. Meredith in. Of course, that didn't happen, and that brings on the scenario I'm telling you about, the 5 student personnel people who walked across the road into, right there were lights there that had been shot out by that time, or thrown out with bricks. We were building a new building, which was Shoemaker Hall at the time, and the building was up. The bricks had been delivered for the entire building, but they hadn't been put up yet. So they were just, it was perfect ammunition for these people that were here from all over the country. Some people were arrested as young as 13 and 15 years old from as far away as California. Of course, primarily it was Mississippians. It was, of course, townspeople here, but Mr. Barnett had made some pronouncements at the football game in Jackson the night before, and what had happened during this period of a month before enrollment, when all this business of bringing him to campus and him being turned down, was that every kook in the country, and there are some people out there, unfortunately, that wherever there's some action, they're going. Doesn't matter what it is. So they had gathered, and they were here. They were all around, and they were on campus at that particular point. Well, the 5 of us walked across the street into the darkness, and at that point, the mob engulfed us. We started looking for students, and wasn't able to identify a single one. But you hear about a faceless mob. That's really what it is. Well, they took us, and they kind of used us as shields to try to get into the Lyceum building. And, of course, the marshals started shooting tear gas, and at that point, some of them were hit. We fortunately were not, and were able to get back into the Lyceum building. But back in that office, we heard the conversations going and coming from Washington and from the local federal officials. And we saw the men that were being hit. We knew nothing about the murders, really. For the entire night, until about 4 o'clock in the morning, nobody indicated that there had been that kind of violence. Of course, we knew that when the people in the National Guard came in, and they were pretty battered up. They came into the Lyceum building. We had one doctor that finally got in to the building, and then we had one person by the name of George Street, that was slipping in and out, bringing medical supplies in from outside. But we were able to only get one doctor in. But back in that office, we heard the conversations, and we saw the men that were wounded being brought in at one point. I'm sure all of you have been through the Lyceum building. There's this long hallway this way, and there's a long hallway east and west. There was a point when you could not walk down either of those hallways without stepping on or over wounded men. It was that kind of situation. But at any rate, along in the night, and time did not really mean anything. It didn't register, so I didn't know what time it was. But Mr. McShane runs in, and he yelled to the top of his lungs, "Permission to use firearms." And Mr. Kennedy was on the other end, and he immediately said, "Denied." He didn't wait for the local people to make a decision. He made the decision. And Mr. McShane said, but sir, they're shooting at us with high-powered rifles. We're down to our last case of tear gas. And the truck coming from the university airport has been hijacked. Permission denied. He said, but sir, permission denied. He said, but sir, what are we to do? And do you know what Robert Kennedy told him? Use your billy clubs. That was that. And you know that what would have happened had they started shooting into that mass of people that were out there. So Robert Kennedy's been a hero of mine ever since that day. And he was a great man. Well, through the night, of course, they brought up, they would take a car and set it ablaze with gasoline and get it running and then jump out and run it against trying to get into the Lyceum building. Actually, what they were doing, they would be running against those big Army vehicles that were there. At one point, a guy brought up a Caterpillar that had been used on that construction site I was telling you about. And fortunately, he was drunk, and there was a tree there that he kind of glazed. And while he was trying to back up, one of the marshals knew what to do, and he ran out and pulled some of the electrical wires off and disabled the Caterpillar. And so we did avoid that. And all of those of us that were on the inside, of course, were actually, I guess we were changing sides every now and then, depending on how the battle was going. But we survived the night, and after the troops started coming in, and the troops incidentally numbered 23,000. All of them had pup tents. They were all over campus for, 10 days or so. And of course we had checkpoints, and they searched cars as you came in. But finally, the Army got here, and order was restored. And this is the most tragic part for me, I guess. As the sun was coming up the next morning, we stumbled out of the Lyceum building, and the streets there were burned cars everywhere. But what got me was the complete surface of the circle, the roads around it, the streets, blood, vomit from the tear gas, bottles, bricks were piled so high that you could hardly see the pavement. And then I started home and got down to what was then called Four-Way. I don't know, it's down where Abner's is. There was a Texaco station right across the road. I came up to a red light and stopped. There was an old black man who came up from the other direction and stopped. There was two highway patrol cars sitting out on the apron of that Texaco station. Two young boys, they couldn't have been more than 16, ran out and started slashing at the tires of the car that the old black man was driving. I'm sure he was unaware of anything that was going on anywhere. He was going to work. Well, I ran the red light. He ran the red light. I went home to try to sleep, but didn't. He went on to wherever he was going, whatever his work was. But I had to contemplate for a period of time man's inhumanity to man. That's my story. John, you can do the inspiration.
Well, I don't know that I can inspire more than that, Ken. I think that graphic description tells more than I can begin to tell about those events. I would say that John Doerr, you mentioned, was
It was there.
His Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division, and his direct superior was a man named Burke Marshall, who was in Bob Kennedy's office with him in the Justice Department. John was as trusted an associate of Bob Kennedy as any person. Jim McShane had been a New York police detective. He had known Bobby Kennedy before Robert Kennedy went to the Justice Department, and he was a perfect selection as U.S. Marshal, Chief of U.S. Marshals. He was fearless. He was tough-minded, tough-talking. He had the loyalty of those marshals, and you can believe that when he called for permission to open fire, he saw his men going down. He knew that rifle fire was deadly, and it's not surprising to me to hear Ken say that Jim asked 3 times for permission, nor is it surprising, knowing him, that Robert Kennedy said denied, denied, denied. And had they opened fire, as Ken just said, it would have been characterized so differently. There would have been a real sense that there was a slaughter by the authorities. More than 150 marshals lined those halls, wounded. More than a dozen Mississippi National Guardsmen helping the marshals, wounded. The problem from Bob Kennedy's position was that very difficult from that office in the Justice Department, from which he is communicating also to the President at the White House. President who is trying to weigh whether to go on television, and if to go on television, what to say. I mean, Governor Barnett had sent mixed signals during the day. No, we won't provide protection. Yes, we will provide protection. The President goes on television thinking that the second answer is the answer. And I guess while Jack is on the air, marshals are falling and gunfire is ringing out and tear gas is permeating this beautiful campus. And to add to Kennedy's disability from his command post, on the one hand dealing with the President and trying to keep the President accurately involved, and at the same time maintain contact and control. Add to that the total disorganization. The Defense Department failed miserably to well coordinate the coming of the troops. Troops literally got lost on the way in, and they came too late. And when they got here, it was overkill. As you say, those pup tents all over, far more troops than were needed. I'm sure the administration wanted to send a message, but to send that message, it would have had to come earlier in the day. The one aspect of it that quite frequently goes unnoted although the media has covered it quite well, and the books on the events covered it quite well. General Edwin Walker had been in command of the troops in Little Rock. From Dallas, retired General Walker sends out a call all across the country. He wants the mob here, and he wants to command the mob here. Yes, I was on the wrong side of Little Rock. I'm on the right side now. And from around the Confederate Memorial, he spews hatred and sedition and adds to the chaos and confusion and violence and injury. You know, you think of the federal government as being all-powerful, in control, in command. You think of Bobby as being the general. He made the right call, as Ken said. But in the final analysis, when you look at it, the government was flying by the seat of its pants. The military lost. The marshals unable to defend themselves as they felt they were entitled. It only added, the confusion only added to the chaos of the mob and the bloodlust that drove the assaults on the marshals and the guardsmen. I think I'll stop there, Ken. And
Well, I'd like to ask you, maybe you can explain this. I have never understood. Most of the mob knew where Mr. Meredith was.
in Old Baxter,
Yeah, which is way up on the hill.
right?
It's an old dormitory. I don't know what they've got in there now, but it's up on the hill next to where printing and all that stuff is up there. They didn't attack him. They attacked the Lyceum building. That Lyceum building that the federal authority had encircled. And I have an idea that that building was symbolic. And I wanted to ask you what you think of the state versus federal, states' rights versus the power of the federal government. And that those people were fighting against a symbol, which they call their way of life. And although they hated Mr. Meredith for what he had done, they weren't attacking him directly.
No, I think the level of hatred toward Robert Kennedy and the president probably transcended the hatred for James Meredith. So I agree. I agree completely that it was the helmeted marshals with those guns and canisters that evoked that violent response, and they were there, and they were targets, and in a real sense, they were sitting ducks. After the tear gas is fired, there is no real defense against the attack. And so they stand there and go down and go down and go down and are brought into the Lyceum for treatment and for help.
You know, the building itself being the oldest, the first university, the oldest institution, state institution, I think that
You know, that dichotomy
represented the state.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That dichotomy of the federal marshals taking over possession of our place. For Mississippians in the mob, at least, it was a motive, no doubt about it. You're right about that.
Well, you may have questions that you want to ask. Or, Mr. Moderator, you're the man. Excuse me.
Well, I mean, you talk about how a lot of people came from around the country and how, I mean, certainly a lot of people were townspeople here that were upset, but a lot of people were just looking for the action, you say, and they came. But we are stuck with the perception after the events are unfolded, and we've been left with that perception since 1962. Why do you think we have been stuck with that just that uneasiness, that Mississippi, I don't know, the racial tensions are maybe still bad down here, even in 2010 when events such as Rodney King's beating, 1991, that's Los Angeles, 1992, the LA uprisings, I mean, that's way more recent, like 30 years more recent. Why do you think that those perceptions have stuck here, and what can you do to alleviate those perceptions? Because I think racial harmony here is better than it's ever been. I think if you look at a Saturday in the Grove, it's not white, black, yellow, it's everybody here.
I just say, for my part, I think every time Ole Miss remembers, every time Ole Miss, that plaque that was put up yesterday, Jim Meredith's symbol standing where it does, every time Ole Miss remembers, acknowledges the violence of that past and puts it down, I think it's another step toward sending the message that this is a different place, that yes, it was lynch law justice now. This is a place that acknowledges a need for justice and comity and conciliation in a democratic society. I as often as it's done, it makes a difference. I sat at this very place, I guess a couple of years ago, and journalists had come from all over to recall how it was in Ole Miss, and to say again, what a blessing it is to come to this place, see the diversity here, see the intellectual ferment here, see the willingness of students and faculty and administration to acknowledge the past and put it behind us, So that's my response.
Well, I think a part of it is the general perception of Mississippi and the South in general. In some areas of the country, I know as a Mississippian, if I go to some national meetings, or this has been my experience, it's not so much now, but certainly around that period and right after, people knew exactly how I felt. And they would tell me. If you walked, for example, in Chicago, if I were to go into a hotel, many times the clerk would say, really, we feel just like you do, when he saw that I was from Oxford, Mississippi. So it's not just Mississippi, but it's racial, I hate to use the word hatred, but there is that element in our society for anybody that's different. And it's the same for somebody from Mississippi. In that a general perception is that we are not quite as intellectually acute, that we still go barefoot. And that, I think, lends itself to assisting, or it's in line with a feeling of the fact that we're not making the kind of progress that we're making. And I agree with you. We've made a great deal of progress, especially with jobs and with a lot of different things. But socially, we've got a long, long way to go in Mississippi and elsewhere. I recall one time, right after the Meredith crisis, the university was trying to redeem itself. I may be taking up too much time. But you know what the College Board is. It's the testing people, whether it's GRE or SAT or whatever. The university decided this was a prestigious institution that we wanted to be a part of, and up until that time, they had not admitted Southern schools. It was primarily an Eastern and a West Coast institution, the College Board. Well, they have at the Waldorf Astoria. They have these big tables where people sit around for lunch, and there were about 10 of us around the table, and we started introducing ourselves. And when I introduced myself, this little nun sitting over to the side said, "Oh." And I said, "Who are you and where are you from?" She was from Saint something somewhere. And she said, "But," and I said, "Well, what do you do?" She said, "I teach history, but not from your perspective." And I used my Southern charm. I said, "Ma'am, how do you know? How do you know what my perspective is of history?" Well, the other people around the room were embarrassed, so they kind of clapped. It was a challenge to me because I said, I'm going to be a trustee of this institution. I'm going to stay here. I'm going to stick with it. 4 years later, in a national election, I became a trustee of the College Entrance Examination Board. So that's what challenges Mississippians. If you encounter discrimination, whether you're black or white, the fact that you take that as a challenge and make up your mind that you're going to show them. I think that's the answer.
There was a question, Kevin, and then we'll go.
I've been around here a lot longer than the other students in here, and I was here during the 40th remembrance, and I was fortunate enough to meet the Honorable Constance Baker Motley before she passed away, and I was able to hear Bishop Gray's story of that night and how he was pulled down from the memorial and beaten by the general that you talked about. My question for each of you would be, do you have a story of, you think, someone involved in that night who's been overlooked by history? Or stories that you've heard later about someone who, history has overlooked, basically, their actions at that time?
Well, the story is just, as often as there is a person who was here, there is a story to go with it.
Absolutely.
Everybody saw it from so many different perspectives. And most of the stories are not heroic. They reflect pathos and pain, and to a large degree regret.
Well, just in response to that, people who write books, and even news people sometimes, they're going to interview chancellors, they're going to interview deans, and people maybe that were primarily involved. But I know in terms of university staff, nobody has ever interviewed. There are two people that are still living that spent the night in the Lyceum. None of those people were ever interviewed for anything. And so it's just I think there's a selective process in whom do you interview? A dean who happened to be in his bed that night or watching TV, or somebody who was on the scene?
Yes?
My question parallels a little bit to that. I was wondering what your recollection was of Medgar Evers.
Medgar Evers.
Right.
Yeah, Medgar Evers. And if you had any recollection of his role in...
Well, for most of us in the Justice Department, he was the name of a courageous lawyer, like many courageous black lawyers who represent the NAACP in the South. And his death was a great tragedy. We know the story. He comes home, he's murdered in his backyard. His wife and children are inside. Merle Evers, with whom I've talked some about that time. Just imagine the horror, knowing that Parks in the garage is coming into the house, his life snuffed out. Beyond that, he's almost mystic. He's almost a mythical figure.
He's kind of overlooked though a little bit. On that day, James, I guess he was the attorney for Meredith and the enrollment for the Lyceum.
I think, yeah.
I think so.
Jim Meredith was a rather difficult. Jim McShane would say Jim Meredith was a very difficult personality to deal with, and he ran through several lawyers, and I can't remember that Medgar Evers represented him, but he very probably did. Several other people did. And Jim is difficult to get along with today. Even among friends, it can be to be on a panel with him can be difficult. Man of great courage and great insight, but Jim McShane, I think, of everyone in the Justice Department, had the most difficult assignment at all, and that was trying to keep Meredith safe, in spite of Meredith's occasional inclination. I think I'll just go out there myself. And I think he drove Jim crazy, Jim McShane crazy.
Other questions? Let me ask one. Most of what the students that are here, or many of them here, are a part of a law class, a media law class. And, they have gone through a period of studying the First Amendment and thinking about it. And a good bit of the time they think about it in historical terms, although now they're starting to look at some very contemporary issues. And I wonder, John, this question is to you. I just wonder, when you think about your work with the First Amendment, and you kind of think back to that time of those riots as well, and we think about human impulses that both of you have touched on, bloodlust and inhumanity and things like that. And we look at a story that we're still, it seems as though we're still sort of sorting out a little bit in some of the strands of it. Where do you see the First Amendment today in terms of an instrument for continuing to ensure justice and ensure the kinds of situations that will promote the sort of courage that we still need?
Well, it's a very good question, and it's one that too often we ignore. There's a very real question about whether we can continue to maintain this. I mean, it's close to an absolute right of free expression, and the new technology has only expanded our ability to say more things in more different ways, and say offensive things and irresponsible things in irresponsible ways. Traditionally, the courts have come down most often, and not always the case, in times of crisis, in times of national security. It's not true. We have ebbs and flows, but most often the courts have come down in broadening rights of free expression. And I suppose that as I think about where we are now, I remember words of one of the founders. I mean, when I speak on the First Amendment, I'd prefer to recite the eloquence of Thomas Jefferson or James Madison, both of whom are our most articulate spokesmen. Alexander Hamilton said, before we get a Bill of Rights, he says this. He says, whatever fine words are inserted in a constitution. Freedom of the press altogether will depend, and these are his words, on public opinion and the general spirit of the people and the government. And what he is saying is, if you give it to them, if you give them freedom of the press, you can also take it away from them. And when public opinion and the general spirit of the people of the government is pushed to the point that they want to take it away, they'll take it away. And as we move into a world of anonymous free expression, burgeoning irresponsible free expression, it's protected, but Hamilton's words are there. When public opinion and the general spirit of the people in the government get fed up, they can take it away.
Thank you. I want to thank everyone. We're completely out of time. I want to thank our panelists,
Right.
and thank you all for being here today.